Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. I think we start this and it's probably almost 3 years gonna happen this summer with the Study Smart tutors. We are extremely feeling grateful to serve the communities and share the knowledge and listening your expertise and your thoughts around the topics that we are going to hit it today with the practice for effective data analysis and visualization. Here with me that I have my team. My name is Julia Odabas. I am the Senior Director of Education with Study Smart Tutors. Always love about to brag my background as a former school counselor, worked in Title I school. Love what we do and how we do it. And I have my amazing team that I'm going to get started with Jack, who is our CEO and founder of the Study Smart Tutors. And then we'll get started.
Thank you all for being here. As Julia mentioned, Jack Friedman, our Study Smart Tutors founder and CEO, and excited to have our whole education leadership team as part of this call.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Lego. I am the Director of Curriculum for Study Smart Tutors. My background is in education. I was a former high school teacher for 10 years in Los Angeles, but happy to be here with this company and also supporting you all and all our partners as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Vargas. I am the Director of Instruction. Been with the organization for now 4 years, full-time. Started out as instructor before that for, I want to say 3 or 4 years. So been with Study Smart for quite some time and definitely excited to be chatting with you all a little bit more about some effective data frameworks and visualization techniques.
Awesome. We want to get started with something fun before we talk about the data. Not that the data is not fun. It's going to be very fun, very engaging next 45 minutes to hour. But we want to get started with something fun. So my team will put up a link on the chat. When you click that, you will see the Mentimeter that we are going to ask you to dream with us. Where would you like to travel in near future? We love this activity because it's really only takes a fun time and do it. So there's that link, and then you'll be able to click that link and then share with us. Where would you like to go? Awesome. Brazil and the north up there. Beautiful. And if you don't have the access to Mentimeter, you can please feel free to put up on the chat as well. Okay. More people going to Alaska, it seems like it. I don't have access to click on my end, but if I were, I would really want to go to India. That's my, well, we'll say bucket list to visit. Beautiful. Okay, we have Europe. Absolutely. Fun, fun, fun. Which part of the Europe do you want to specifically see? Sorry, I don't know your name because your name looks like a test to me on my end. Happy to change it. Any specific part of the Europe? Oh, okay. Welcome to Paris. Beautiful. Awesome. Well, we appreciate it, you joining us. We want to start it with something, a fun data collection before we talk about the serious data collection with our team.
You didn't tell them that we were starting a travel agency?
We are gonna, we are gonna start a travel agency. Maybe we'll ruffle some airplane tickets. Just kidding. We are not going to sell your data to someone else. We'll talk about the ethic and everything. Okay, so now the next question we want you to answer in the same link, and I'll go ahead and move to that one again. Since you're all here, that we are assuming that you have some type of interest in data, or you might want to learn more about the data, the question that we'll ask, what types of data do you collect? And John will lead us in the conversation.
Right. Thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, so go ahead and feel free to use that Mentimeter link. Again, if some of you cannot access it, go ahead and use the chat box provided as well. But start thinking about your own programming and what types of data you currently collect or that your program collects. Go ahead and type those responses either in the chat box if you only have access to that, or the Mentimeter as well, if you can do that. And if maybe you don't collect any, you don't, that's fine as well, right? I think that's one of the purposes of today's training as well, our webinars, to find out where we are and how we can move forward. All right, so this person wrote my own health data. Love that. There's a ton of apps out there, a ton of watches now that allow us to track our own health data on a pretty regular basis. Love that response. Thank you. What other data do we collect, either in our personal lives, and that's fine as well, or our programming? All right, listing of academic probation. So which students are on academic probation, perhaps? Definitely important data to track. Give it maybe another 15 seconds. All right, student attendance. Yeah, definitely important as well. So tracking our student attendance for our programs, feedback, right? What kind of feedback are we getting back from our partners, from our students, from the communities that we serve, right? So definitely looking at program feedback. Awesome. All right, so thinking about these three, thank you for those who participate in this, right? Someone wrote my health data, academic probation, and then student attendance and programming. Julia, can you go ahead and progress to the next question for us? Thinking about those three, how do you use that data to inform decision-making? So again, I know this says within your programming, but maybe within your own personal life, if you looked at health, your health data, how do you use that data to inform yourself? So whether we're looking at health, probation, academic probation, attendance, program effectiveness, how do you use that to drive decision-making? What do you do with that data?
We accept this is a tough question.
Yeah.
This is a hard question, and we are hoping that you will get an answer after this webinar, but we are curious to hear your thoughts with this tough question.
All right, I'll give it another 20 seconds. All right, this person wrote, if I know if I'm hitting my daily target, right? Definitely. So I think, if we're talking about health, definitely it's, those health apps are great to ensure that we are reaching our whatever SMART goals or target goals that we have set for ourselves. Absolutely. I love that response. Okay. So, I think this is a tough question, like my colleague Julia said, right? Again, gathering data is one piece, but the second piece, is just as important, if not more important, is what do we do with that data? What are our next steps when we gather this data from either our students, from our personal lives, or our health, or fitness, whatever that may be? We want to think about what do we do with that data next? And so hopefully, after today's webinar, you'll have some new frameworks and ideas for how to best utilize data within the programs that you serve and are part of. At this point, I do want to move forward by showing a few images, and these images are going to be, lead us into our conversation today about data analysis and visualization. And so with these next images that I want to show, I want you to think about inferences or conclusions that you can make based on these observations of the images. And I want you to type these into the chat box. So feel free to chat multiple times, but here is image 1. So looking at image 1, I want you to think about, again, what inferences can be made all right. What inferences can be made based on your observations of this image? And go ahead and use that chat box to write down some of your responses. So what conclusions or inferences can be reached based on what's presented here? So for example,
it can be simple things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it can be simple things, right? Like weather looks nice outside.
All right. So Kenji writes, there are stores, definitely, right? So there are some stores here, and maybe that's based on the parking lot, maybe the sign that says Newark Mall, right? The buildings, right? So it's definitely there's some stores there. You're right, there appears to be a filter on the photo, absolutely, right? There's some type of filter on the photo, or maybe it's later in the afternoon, absolutely. Dr. Julia writes, there's cars, there's a parking lot, right? So inferences that we can make, conclusions that we can make, maybe this is a busier area, right? I like what Kenji wrote, there's some storefronts, so maybe this is a business park of some sort, right? If you look to the right of this image, you might even see some tables out here. So you see palm trees, so somewhere that's usually warm. So maybe this is in a hotter state, right? Where palm trees are a little bit more prevalent and out there. Awesome. Okay, I love that. All right, so let's move on to a second image. I want you to do the same exercise here, right? So we have some ideas here. This is maybe we see some parking lots here. We see a lot of cars, some palm trees, so maybe a warmer area, right? So some inferences that we can make that maybe this is a business area, okay? Not England, Kenji says, okay. So maybe it's not in a different part, based on the buildings and the style, it's not in a particular part of the world. I love that, I love that, okay? So let's move to the second image, okay? Here's the second image, same exercise. Looking at this image, what inferences can be made based on your observations of this image? What can we conclude about this maybe location? What can we say about it based on what we see here? All right, so Greg says residential zoning, right? So maybe that's because of the houses, right? We see a lot of houses, maybe it's a residential area. Jay writes clear skies. And again, same thing, residential area, right? We're seeing homes, we're seeing cars parked. Kenji writes brown hill in the background, dry climate, yeah. Right, so we see hills in the background. Again, they're not as green, so maybe it's a drier area. Lauda writes it's springtime maybe, okay? Maybe we get that from maybe the purple flowers from the trees, right? From some of the greenness in some of the areas, right? Maybe an English-speaking area. Interesting, okay. So we have some observations, mid to high financial status, all right? So maybe based on the types of homes and what we see there, maybe financial status is something that we can get an idea of. Love it. All right, so these are those first two images. Now I'm gonna show you one last image, and this is gonna be a little bit different from the first two. With this last image is actually a complete picture of both image 1 and image 2. So if you look to the left, we have image 1 and image 2 to the right. What I want us to think about now, and feel free to chat this in the chat box, is what happens when we expand our view. So now we have a very expansive, complete view of this area. How does this new image change or shift our observations, or maybe even our inferences from image 1 and 2? Does it change the way that we see this area? Does it modify in any type of way? Do we think differently about it? What do we maybe learn from looking at this complete image? Give you a few moments to kind of think about that. And if anyone wants to put that, an observation or idea in the chat box, feel free to do that. So I think as we expand our view, right, get a kind of larger grasp for what this area looks like, I think what we start to do is think about, again, what does this bigger picture look like, right? So when we think about this image, I think, I went from one small image or one small sector to kind of a larger picture, right? And I think this is something that we want to do when we examine our data. Right? We want to be both very specific with our analysis, but also expansive in our data sets and how we analyze that. We want to think about the data narrative lens and the lenses that our data visualization support. And when I think about that, I think about, for example, the relationship, kind of like a children's book. You have your text, your story, and then you have your accompanying pictures. Both support each other in providing the reader, right, this larger comprehensive understanding of the story. And I think that's something that we want to think about when we look at data. What are the small pieces that we look at, and how does that relate to the bigger picture of where this data came from, that data set came from? And that's something that we want to think of as we develop frameworks and visualizations for the data that we look at. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to my colleague, Jordan, who's going to talk a little bit more about data ethics and analysis into some detail.
Yeah, thanks, John. And so we wanted to start out this conversation around data analysis by first grounding it in ethics. It's really important that we address this topic of data ethics before we get into some of the more nitty-gritty details, because data ethics plays a role from end to end in your data processing. So whether it's on the collection end, right, how you're acquiring your data, to where you're storing that data, all the way down the line to the algorithms and the models that you implement to explore that data. We've seen analysis and data practices go awry, right? If we think back to some large ramifications recently in the world of Facebook, right? When 500 million plus users had their personal information leaked. There's even smaller community ramifications. I think most recently of the LAPD's decision to rescind or retract their predictive policing programs that were essentially reinforcing historically bad behaviors and bad practices. And so we really want to have that foundation of data ethics, and we hope that you consider that as well, wherever you're at in your data journey. Moving on, we can explore data ethics a little bit further by just giving you 5 very basic codes to follow, 5 key principles. You can add to this list, you can take away from it for sure, but we want to be mindful of privacy. We also want to be mindful of transparency in our data practices, oversight and review. So are we refining, retuning, checking our assumptions, asking other questions, looking at it from different angles, down to regulation. What are the laws that are in place? If you need some guiding works in this realm, you can definitely check out the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, as a guiding document. And if you are in California, the CCPA has some really, really good updated information on what privacy looks like, what data ethics in practice actually looks like. And that last one is fairness. And so with data ethics at the foundation, we can start to dive into the analysis component. And traditionally, data analysis falls into a few different camps. We can think from a more technical perspective around descriptive data analysis, which essentially answers what happened. You can also think of diagnostic analytics, which plays into why did it happen? Then you move into predictive analytics, what could happen? Prescriptive analytics, what can we do about it, right? And now, with the advent of technology, we also want to consider adaptation and automation, right? And what are the implications that those powerful technologies have in data practice? So those are more of the technical pieces in data analysis. What we want to provide you all today is a little bit more on the metacognitive side of things, where we think about how we go about viewing data. And so hopefully this framework that we present to you today gives you a good feel for thinking and viewing your data. We know that a framework is important to have. And so we want to be very clear, very upfront that, hey, this is a way that you can systemize and standardize some practices within your team at the, I see in the chat, metacognitive data, I love it. Some ways that you can, think about data at the individual level, but that there's consistency even as you move into your teams and even as you move into your organization at a larger scale. We want to be on the same page when it comes to data vocabulary, data conversations, data acumen, and all of this is going to really help facilitate that collaboration and avoid siloed thinking, siloed perspectives, kind of like John imaged in that initial warm-up, where we just only looked at one piece of that bigger picture. And also, I think a framework will also help us avoid error, help us course correct, and it does allow for some reproducibility in the work that we do. So today we're presenting the ladder of inference. And the ladder of inference is a metaphor and framework to help kind of set the tone and the pace for data inquiry. This is often something that we do without realizing it. We do this every day, right? We take in observable data from our senses, and whether we recognize it or not, we jump to conclusions, right? Our brains are hardwired to make these cognitive shortcuts. And so what I love about the ladder of inference is that it has a start from the bottom. Let's see what is observable. And then from there, what do we want to narrow in on? Can we filter that data? And then as we go up the rung, we will begin to make more well-rounded, better informed decisions. And so today, John's going to walk us through some of those rungs in that ladder. And hopefully this helps you feel a little bit more confident in this data framework approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Now, as Jordan just mentioned, right, the ladders of inference, it's a framework for examining data in an objective type of way. So what does that framework look like? Essentially, the framework does have 7 rungs or steps that we want to engage in as data practitioners, right? And that essentially that leads us from inquiry, right, kind of questions, asking those questions, to advocacy. So some type of solutions. We have this data. What are we going to do with that data? And so, like Jordan said, right, a lot of these things that we are, we might already do, but maybe not formally, right? And maybe it's something that we do informally or within our own thought processes. But again, there are 7 rungs or steps to this. And so when you look at these, it starts at the bottom, as Jordan said. You start with your observations. That's followed by selection, meaning, assumptions, conclusions, beliefs, and actions. And now if you notice to the right of that ladder, just like a real ladder, you can go up and down those rungs, right? This is a process, this process is a reflective loop. So if you go up, you can come back down. You don't have to go all the way to the top right away. You and your organization or your colleagues can definitely go back and rework and go through these steps over again. But if we were to go through this from bottom to top, we start with our observations, right? Our observations are on that bottom rung. This is the information observed from the real world. So what are you observing in this larger scope, for example? This could be attendance, as someone mentioned earlier on, right? Maybe we're examining attendance overall, or participation from students, or maybe overall program effectiveness. Those are our larger observations. But once we've identified what that observation is, what we want to focus on then is that selection piece. So once that is identified, you're going to select your data. You filter to that selected data from what you observed. So for example, with this, it might be, I want to focus specifically on 9th grade attendance during our summer programming. So you make, again, a selection from that larger scope of data that you are targeting, okay? Now, once you've made that selection, you're going to move on to meaning, right? Making meaning of that selection or that data that comes through. How do you interpret the facts that are presented to you? What trends do you notice in that selected data set? Do you see things going up? Do you see things going down? So what is the meaning that you are making out of that presented or that data that's gathered? Now, once you've done that, these next 3 rungs are a little bit, they overlap in some ways. And I think it's just a process that we want to constantly revisit as, again, practitioners of data. And so for this next step, this idea of assumptions it means, after the data is interpreted, you make assumptions based on those assigned meanings. So this might even include examining possible causes or reasons for the data being the way it is, the outcome of that data looking a certain way. So you start to assume, you start to kind of question these things. Again, once you move up that ladder, you then move on to your conclusions. So we draw conclusions based on the assumptions or those kind of prior beliefs or ideas that we have or assumptions that we have. The question that we want to ask ourselves is, what can I conclude from this gathered data? What is kind of like, what direction are we moving? What is our next steps once we've kind of gathered all this information? Now, as we approach the top of this rung or this ladder, right, before advocating, we want to look at this belief rung, right, which is essentially a re-examination of our own belief systems. This step involves either adopting new beliefs, sticking to our own beliefs, or maybe updating those beliefs based on conversations that we're having with our colleagues, or even closer examinations of that data set that we're looking at, right, that 9th grade attendance sheet. And so this belief system is key because, again, it really forces us to really take a critical lens at that data set. And once that's done, once we've had those conversations, once we've looked at that in a closer lens, we're left with that action, okay? Which the action is developing those next steps, right? On those beliefs and conclusions, okay? So it's a pretty thorough process. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to go all the way up. You can definitely move around and shift around this ladder. Like I said, it is a reflective loop here. And so I know this is a lot of information. So what does this look like? Here's kind of a brief example of what this can look like with a practice data set over here. So let's take a quick look at this example. So for this observation piece, again, what is that real world observation? In this case, this example, we're looking at attendance for 2022, right? What does attendance look like for 2022? As we move up that rung, right, we move into the selection piece. So within that observation, I want to specifically select the 9th grade level. So looking at specifically 9th graders, okay? Let's move up a little bit further. After we've gathered that data, we start to look at the data set specifically for 9th grade. I examine it, I begin to make meaning of it, right? And notice I do see there is a decrease in 9th grade attendance. Maybe that's the observation that I make, that again, attendance has decreased within this specific group. So we move up that rung. Again, we look at assumptions. There could be multiple, there could be one, but we look at these assumptions, and maybe one of those assumptions is attendance is low. There's a decrease in it because of the current pandemic during that time. All right, and so that's one assumption. So we'll work up from that one assumption. You have that assumption, and let's start to make some conclusions. One conclusion is, hey, we're finding out that the 9th graders are struggling with online learning, right? Because of COVID, there is this struggle that they're having. We don't know exactly what they're struggling with, but it's maybe having to do with the online learning process. So we draw that conclusion. And again, we move up that ladder. And then we begin to look at our adopted belief systems, right? And maybe one of them might be, hey, the students are lazy. Or maybe we have conversations with our colleagues and we look at the data a little bit further. Maybe it's updated to, hey, actually, it's not that they're lazy. Maybe it's the technology piece, that they're really struggling with that piece. Chromebooks, Wi-Fi, Zoom, Google Classroom, all these new technology pieces that are being integrated into online learning in these last couple of years. And so if that is what the target kind of piece is, if that's the belief, then we can finally move to that top part, right, of action, which is leading us towards that advocacy piece, right? Taking action, which is in this case, hey, because they're struggling with technology, our focus moving forward for this next semester or for the spring or in the next school year should be focusing on technology support for those 9th graders. So this is just a very quick example of how this framework looks and how you could use it with particular data sets that you want to examine within your own programming. Okay. Now, keep in mind that this is a complicated, right? This is a complicated framework that's not going to, you're not going to adopt it and it's going to come naturally right away. Again, we do a lot of these steps internally, but maybe we jump around. And again, that is part of the reflective loop, but we want to be very intentional in how we use this framework, right? We want to use it to our advantage. And so I just want to provide a few helpful tips, 3 tips to help guide you through this process. And then we'll link this to what this looks like in terms of the visualization piece. But tip 1, excuse me, is essentially using the ladders of inference at any stage of your thinking process. So like I said, it is a reflective loop. You don't need to start at the very bottom. If you're already midway through, you can start right in that middle rung, work your way up, work your way down. But as you use that, we want to make sure that we are asking questions that help guide and refine our data analysis, right? Asking questions is key. So there's a handful listed here that I won't read, but this is the key to really getting that critical lens and figuring out our next steps as we reach towards advocacy. And part of that is also challenging our own thinking processes, challenging ourselves in our own thinking process, which includes our own assumptions, our own biases, our own beliefs, our own conclusions that, as Jordan said earlier, and Julia, that we might tend to jump to right away. So that's tip number 1. Now, tip 2 is when you're working through these reasonings, right, as you're working through this ladder system, we want to make sure that you are looking out for the rungs that you tend to jump, as I kind of just mentioned, right? It can be easy to skip some of these things and jump to automatic assumptions and conclusions based on, again, our own upbringings, our own experiences, maybe a similar data set that we looked at in the past. So, you know, we might want to jump right away, like, hey, this happened with this school. Maybe it's probably the same here. But we want to stray away from jumping to those immediate conclusions and assumptions. Again, at this step, with this tip, we want to ask ourselves those critical questions that deepen our understanding of that data set, right? And if you feel the need to revisit some of those former rungs, right, as mentioned earlier, you have that opportunity to hop back down. Let's say you've made your way all the way up to the beliefs, but maybe you don't think this is the right direction, or you have a colleague who's brought up another point that you didn't realize. This is an opportunity to step back down, right? Take a few steps down and revisit some of those earlier assumptions or conclusions that were drawn based on the data set. Okay. And finally, our tip 3 is, like anything, everything that involves practice, you want to work up that ladder again, revisit it, keep going back to it. It's secular in many ways. And so with this, when you go back up that ladder, when you go up back another rung, think about it with new reasoning, right? So this time, go up with new reasoning, look at some new data if it involves you looking at some different data sets, new assumptions, new beliefs, and new conclusions. By going through it again and being secular with it, this will allow you to really determine your next actionable steps or what's best in terms of priorities, right? Like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be, it's not only just maybe one solution, there could be multiple, but we definitely want to kind of target what are the specifics that we want to prioritize as we are thinking about actionable steps and advocacy with the data sets that we're receiving. All right. We'll go ahead and pass it back to Jordan for the second piece.
Yeah, thanks, John. And so we'll take that kind of theory of ladder of inference and tie it into this main theme of communication, right? How do we communicate our data to stakeholders, to program partners? How do we ensure that we are painting a picture that's accurate and that is effective? And so we'll also share maybe a few more technical things around data visualizations in particular. I wanted to start out with a quick activity though, where we investigate some raw data. And so you all are going to be data practitioners in action for the next couple of minutes. So on the next slide, I'll have a bunch of raw data, and I'd like you to do your best to draw out the number of 7s that appear in the frame. Okay, count that out and feel free to add your guess to the chat. All right, 30 seconds. All right. That was about 30 seconds. And yeah, y'all actually did a fantastic job. It is 17. Nice work, nice work. But as you can see, that took some time. 17 is the correct answer. So let's revisit that same activity. Y'all are just raw data wizards. Weren't necessarily supposed to get 17 on the first go, but that's okay. Let's compare that first slide to this next one. And right, we can see a very slight alteration of information. That raw data makes things a little bit more accessible. Okay, how about if I change that up to this? Even better? Worse? How is the data collection process when you see information presented this way? Hopefully a little bit easier, right? And so there's several ways that we can visualize data, and we can make things even more transparent. We can bring things to light. So this quick activity of figuring out the 7s, what we're actually doing is we're modifying what we call preattentive attributes. And so as you think about how you want to communicate your data, we want you to consider some preattentive attributes. And so here are the basic ones that we would like to share with you all. We have color, which is, what we did on that first slide where we made some of the 7s appear as blue. You can use size to help engage and help bring things to light. Some texture. You can also use shape, orientation, and value, which is really good for assessing quantitative data and differentiating between values. So that quote up the top, preattentive attributes are visual properties we notice without conscious effort to do so. Preattentive processes take place within 200 milliseconds after exposure to a visual stimulus. And it doesn't require what we call sequential search. Super powerful tool to add into your communication toolbox. And this has some very strong ties to what we deem as the visual brain. This is why communicating over data visualizations is important. The human brain, studies have shown in the 1970s that we can approximately recall about 10,000 visuals with over 80% collection rate. We process images about 60,000 times faster than text. 90% of that information sent to our brain is visual, and we use visual communication on the regular. And so this has led to a very growing and dynamic field in the world of what we call data visualization or information design. So data visualization, as the simplest form, is the practice of visually representing that data. And it is a blend of computer science, stats, artistic design, and of course, storytelling. For the next few minutes, we'll focus mostly on artistic design, maybe get into some storytelling as well. I love that quote down at the bottom by Dr. Kristen Solulski, who is a information operations professor at NYU. Visualizations are only as effective as the insights they reveal. And we've seen these things all around, right? From the latest and greatest dashboards that show maps, that show performance metrics, that determine time zones, purchase rates, revenue, etc. But it's even more than that, right? Data visualization is all around, even to the point where we see these things on TV, right? When we're watching a basketball game, those lines aren't just there. There are some lines painted on the court, which is data viz for the players themselves. But there's also things that appear on the screen that help us collect information about what's going on as well, right? We see that football example there with the first down line and where the ball is currently at. We get some iPhone usage reports as of recently, for better or for worse. And then another good example there is, California school dashboard has decided to use this kind of temperature rating scale to showcase performance of schools. And that is a data visualization choice on their end. And so this is, something that happens all the time. There are leading experts in the industry, and some very, very famous current, one in particular, Edward Tufte, modern pioneer in the world of information design and infographics. He does mention here that graphical excellence is something that gives the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest amount of time with the least ink in the smallest space. So he's a minimalist in practice. And I also appreciate good data viz that showcases a lot of information or allows you to extract a lot of information with as minimal distractions as possible. The other one that I'll highlight here, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is American sociologist, first African-American graduate from Harvard University, was monumental in his work in the early 1900s in showcasing just how we can connect data visualizations to everyday life. Particularly his work and his team's work was done for Black America in 1900. And so he said, the modern way of showing progress of groups of people is by a series of very carefully thought out charts, diagrams, models, etc. And so how does this connect to our data processing pipeline? We start from the gathering position, right? And you can kind of connect this to that ladder that John worked through. But we start with the facts, the statistics that we collect. We then hope to rearrange that data and organize it so that we can pull info, and then from there build knowledge. After the knowledge piece, we have planning that can be done. This might be a little bit more on the prescriptive side of things. In data viz, data visualizations fit right in. They help us answer questions like how many, how much, what is happening as we go from data gathering to info. But they can also help with the why, from info to knowledge. Why is this happening? So a little bit of diagnostic and analysis. If your data visualization is really, really good, really strong, it could even help start some conversation as you move from knowledge to planning and the prescriptive analytics side of things. Good data viz might not only answer questions, but it also causes you to ask more questions about what is happening. And so take a moment to review or revisit this raw data. And what happens if I just slightly rearrange it and put some order to it? It becomes even easier, right? We can count column by column here and arrive at 17, as you all did a little bit earlier, for the number of sevens. And so order has helped us turn this data into info with greater efficacy. Moving beyond just this type of visual, what can we now implement? And so that leads us to the conversation around charts. charts, graphs, tables. And so here is a very, very simple example of how I was able to kind of take all of that raw data, all of that basic facts on the left-hand side, and transform it and communicate it in a way that is a little bit more aggregated, a little bit easier to pick up on. And so there we actually get some information about all of the numbers in that data set. Might be a little bit more cleaner, a little bit easier to identify if I had questions like, how many 7s are in this data set? Greg wants some big data activity here with numbers 1 through 100. Whew, that would be tough, but it is possible. It is possible. And so the power of effective charts is that, one chart will not always be the end all be all. You can always make improvements. And so here we just did a slight modification of going from our aggregates to rearranging the order. And horizontally, now you can see 3 is at the top, right? 34 is at the top, and our 7, poor 7, is nearing the bottom. You might ask some questions like, well, what happened to 7? Why isn't 7 appearing so much, right? And you can move up those rungs of your ladder of inference. You can start to pull and extract, move into beliefs, conclusions, beliefs, and actions. Now, on the technical side of things, this chart does pose a little bit of an issue. It dives into what we call the moire effect. There's kind of a shimmer in the bars. And so you can always make your chart better. And I'm sure you could make this better with time as well. But this view here might be a little bit easier on the eyes. And so with charts, feel free to go through multiple iterations, improve your visualization, especially as you want to tailor it to the audience that you are serving. Some examples of what charts are at your disposal. I want you to think beyond just the bar charts, beyond the pie charts, which I will say are problematic. Most folks in the world of data viz will say avoid pie charts if you can. But if you want to showcase something like distribution, how is your data distributed, you can use scatter plots, you can use histograms. If you want to show composition, which is a pie chart type of feel, you're thinking about parts of the whole, try using a stacked bar chart instead. If you want to show how things are connected, you can use networks. If you want to show relationships, we can use word clouds. And this is a very small sample size of the different type of graphics that are available in modern free open source tech stack, but even in your own creation, right? In your own building of these charts. So I'll leave you with a quick little encouragement, a quick little word for how you can go about building these better data visualizations. This comes from Good Charts. Scott Peronetto, the Harvard Business Review, put forth a really, really good book. Definitely recommend that you spend some time there if you're thinking about communicating your data in an effective way. But he says you can do it in less than 2 hours. You can build better data visualizations with that first 5 minutes of prep, where you set aside some time for that mental space, physical space, white space, right? You get your sticky notes. You start building out that working environment for the next few phases, which are talk and listen, connect with a partner, with a colleague, share the problem at hand. What are you trying to solve? What are you trying to picture? And then from there, after you've had that good conversation, you've narrowed down your why, you can move into sketching. And sketching is the idea of image or chart generation, right? This is where you're getting your brainstorming out on paper. You're starting to really build out these visuals. And we recommend that you do, or Scott recommends that you do at least 2 different forms of that data type. So for example, if you are able to match keywords in your conversation in the talk and listen with the idea of distribution, I need to show the distribution of attendance over the summer. Try using a bar chart or a histogram to show that data. try using a scatter plot. So try out different forms, different avenues for your data viz. Then the last one, prototype, about 20 minutes or so of actually plugging in that data. And this is after you've answered the why, you feel fairly confident about what you're trying to accomplish. Now build, and this is actually the iterative process. So sketching is generative, prototyping is iterative. Wonderful. We know we've given you a lot in this last 45 minutes to 50 minutes, but we would like to end on something that's near and dear to us. And that is that numbers and visuals alone will not always tell the story, right? Numbers, visuals, and stories combined it's probably the best method for delivering and communicating upon your data. And so you can connect this to that ladders of inference as you work through the questions that you ask, the conversations that you have, with really the goal of moving from that raw data. And that data can be coming from multiple different sources, right? You might start to make correlations. You might start to make connections between your social media data, between your student feedback data. And so really you want to be able to move from that raw data to revealing insights and be honest and transparent about your shortcomings, about your successes in the practice, and then ensure that your data visuals accurately complement, as John mentioned a little bit earlier. Like it is almost identical to reading a children's book, right? Where you have the text and you have the pictures to help build out that whole picture. And then that last thing is something that we're always mulling over. We're always thinking about is what do we do? What do we do with these findings? And that will definitely be up to you and the work that you do with your data. All right. Some suggestions that we have for you all, whether you're at the beginning stage of your data journey or you feel pretty seasoned in how you explore and build visualizations to tag alongside your data. We do recommend RStudio, which works in the programming language of R. It is open source, it's free, you can download it right now. And it is a little bit more technical, it takes time to learn. And there are several packages in RStudio that help you make some really, really nice and pretty graphics. Tableau, world-renowned leader in data viz. Good Charts is definitely a good read to pick up. Very simple, easy. I love how it's laid out and designed start to finish. We do some work in Google Sheets here at Study Smart Tutors and building out some of our data viz and doing some of our data manipulation. And then of course, Canva as well. All right. That brings us to the end of our time. Thank you all so much for hanging out. We'll definitely stick around for any questions, any comments that you might have. But with that, I can pass it back over to our moderator, Dr. Julia.
This was awesome. And I'll tell you that I wish I had a chance to listen this before I complete my dissertation. And Jordan might sound as easy as 2 hours. It took me 2 years to all the steps that he laid out for us. But I am excited. And yeah, we are welcoming any question that you have. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.